All right, let's be opening our Bibles to Hebrews chapter 11. And after several weeks of not having a sheet of notes available, I did put one out today for chapter 12. You won't need that today, but please remember to grab a copy of that before you leave sometime today or before next week, because our goal is to be in chapter 12 next week. But we still have a little bit to finish up in chapter 11, and I said a couple of weeks ago we're not going to rush through. I don't want to rush through what we're studying in chapter 11, but I think some of the examples are generic enough at the end that we're just kind of summarizing at the end some historical examples and not necessarily looking at specific stories of some of the folks like we have earlier. So I think we can make it through at least a pretty good way through chapter 11 today. At the end, maybe get to the end of chapter 11. All right, where we left off last week was the beginning of the story of Moses and the actions of faith surrounding the life of Moses. So drop down to verse 23 beginning. And we made some comments on verse 23, but we'll actually start in verse 24. But I want to go ahead and read the rest of the chapter again, get us in the context of what's being spoken of here, and then we'll go back and discuss. Verse 23, by faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents, because they saw he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's command. By faith Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked for the reward, or to the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he who destroyed the firstborn should touch them. By faith they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, whereas the Egyptians, attempting to do so, were drowned. By faith the walls of Jericho fell down after they were encircled for 7 days. By faith the harlot Rahab did not perish with those who did not believe, when she had received the spies with peace. And what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon and of Barak and Samson and Jephthah, also David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, became valiant in battle, turned to flight the armies of the enemies. Women received their dead raised to life again. Others were tortured, not accepting deliverance that they may obtain a better resurrection. Still others had trial of mockings and scourgings, yes, of chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were tempted, were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted and tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and mountains and dens and the caves of the earth. And all these, having obtained a good testimony through faith, did not receive the promise, God having provided something better for us, that they should not be made perfect apart from us. So let's start back in verse 24. Last week we introduced Moses, and we said in verse 23, it's not necessarily Moses, but his parents under consideration, because they hid Moses for 3 months. And we took a look at that, about how they rebelled against the Pharaoh and his order of genocide, how he was trying to kill all the Hebrew males so that they would intermarry, and eventually it would just basically dissolve the Hebrew nation. And they stood against that, including Moses' parents. And we talked about that faith always gives us the courage to conquer over our fears and act in the appropriate way. So in verse 24, one of the great lessons of faith we learn now is that faith accepts the consequences of godliness, because there are usually consequences to that, and faith always keeps us loyal to the people of God. And so both of these lessons are mentioned verses 24 to 26. Now, when he says in verse 24 that he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, we actually have Bible commentary on when this happened in the life of Moses. It wasn't early in his life. It actually happened when he was 40 years old. If you'll go with me to Acts chapter 7. Acts chapter 7. I want to look at two verses in Acts chapter 7. One tells us the age that this happened, what stage of life he was in, and the other tells us a little bit about his upbringing, about some of the advantages he has. And I think that helps us build a word picture to the power of what's said in Hebrews chapter 11. So drop down with me to verse 22 and 23 of Acts chapter 7. This is Stephen's sermon, which is largely a summary of God's development of the scheme of redemption through history. So verse 22, Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptian and was mighty in words and deeds. Now, when he was 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brethren, the children of Israel. All right, now, go back to Exodus chapter 2. Let's turn our Bibles to Exodus chapter 2. Exodus chapter 2. Beginning in verse 1, you have the birth of Moses. We talked about this a little bit last week. And if you'll drop down to verse 7 through 10, this is when there's a conversation. Pharaoh's daughter finds, obviously, the child Moses, and she barters with his own biological mom. And we talked about, a little of that story last week, that she basically is able to raise her own son, but he becomes the son of Pharaoh's daughter. And then in verse 11, it said, it came to pass in those days when Moses was grown, which Stephen tells us is when he was 40 years of age, that he went out to his brethren. He looked at their burdens and saw the Egyptian beating a Hebrew and one of his brethren. And we'll talk a little bit about that story in just a second. But think about his upbringing. Now that he's in the household of Pharaoh, what advantages or opportunities, I guess we should say, what opportunities did he have? Stephen tells us a little of those. His education. And as an Egyptian, would he have had premier education? Yeah, he had the best of the best. He had learning that far surpassed anything else he would have had. And so he was given opportunities as the child of royalty that he would not have otherwise had. And that is now the backdrop against this choice he made to be identified with the Hebrews, because you have to look at what he gave up to realize how important it was for him to identify with the people of God. Now, according to Acts 7, verse 23, he was 40 when he did that. In verse 11 and following, we learn what happens. He goes out, he sees one of the Egyptians beating one of his Hebrew brethren. And what does he do? He kills him. And this becomes the catalyst for his leaving Egypt. Remember, he hides the body, and the next day he is out, and the next time he sees these brethren, and they're fussing at each other, and he tries to intervene, they just sort of bring it up. Are you going to kill one of us like you did the Egyptian man? And he realizes that the word on the street is that he killed an Egyptian guy. So he leaves, and it's another 40 years before he comes back into Egypt to deliver the people of God. But his act against the Egyptians was his choice to join the people of God. He chose the Hebrew people over the Egyptians. He became, by that, an enemy of Egypt. And by that choice, he refused then to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter, because he was cutting himself off from the opportunities and the privileges of having been raised in that. Tom? I suspect that Jochebed trained him in that. I suspect that being raised from a baby by his own mother and among the Hebrew people, I suspect that at some point, now I couldn't tell you when specifically, but it would be hard to imagine that a woman who makes a choice based on God, right, she chooses God over the order of the Pharaoh, would fail to teach her son about the importance of the Hebrew people in the scheme of redemption, in whatever she knew about it. So it must have been along the training that he did that, brother. somewhere.
God had revealed to him what his purpose was.
Yeah.
I don't know anything more.
Yeah, and I don't know that they're exactly parallel, but we could probably do the same thing with Jesus. Jesus was a child. We could say exactly at what time, did he understand that he was in the Father's business? But a lot of that was just based on constant training from the time that they were born. And I think maybe that's the case with Moses. We don't know exactly when, but it's hard to believe that she wasn't teaching him about his place in the program of things. Again, I don't know when, but it's sort of concreted when he makes that choice to do away with the Egyptian and side with the Hebrew people. That's the moment in which he cast his lot definitively with the Hebrews and thus became the enemy of the Egyptians. Now, it's interesting, there are all kinds of refusals like that in the Bible. Can you think of other times when people refused what was popular or what people were entreating them to do and chart a different course because of faith? Okay. Yeah, so he refused Potiphar's wife, and that was a definitive refusal on his part because he did that by faith, even though it's not mentioned in Hebrews chapter 11. I was thinking just a few days ago of Daniel chapter 1. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, end up in Babylonian captivity. That's not where they wanted to be, stripped from their families, and they were still teens when they were stripped away, and they were offered the king's meat, and what'd they do? They refused. They just refused to do it. And remember that there's that great contest, and they come out, they fare better than everybody else. A lot of those refusals have been mentioned in Scripture, and this is one in a list of such refusals by faith where people act that way. Now, go back to Hebrews chapter 11 and look at verse 25. He chose rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. So by choosing that course, he accepted the consequences that came along with that, which meant for him, and he probably couldn't have envisioned that early on, he knew it would probably entail some hardship, but he could not have imagined the kind of hardship that would have been involved in that. But he made that choice by faith. Now, I want to stop here at the end of verse 25 when it mentions the passing pleasures of sin. To have stayed in the place where he was, which was opulent and affluent and sinful, right, as part of the Egyptian culture, because it was a sinful culture, would have identified himself with the wicked, world-loving Egyptian culture, and it would have indicated his love for sin rather than God's favor. And that's kind of how he's following, that's how that's meant in this passage, that his choice shows that he was making a break from a culture that loved sin and indulged in sin, and he made that separation very clear. It was a sanctifying choice that he made. But we can't help but note the concept of the passing pleasures of sin, because it tells us something about sin. What do you learn from this? It's temporary. First of all, the first thing I think we ought to note is there pleasure in sin? There is pleasure in sin. And it's foolish to deny that. And sometimes we think, we tell people, well, sin's not pleasurable and you don't want to involve you. The only reason anybody would ever be involved in sin is because it is pleasurable. It appeals to the physical appetites of people. And 1 John 2, 15 to 17, right? Lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. Those things are enjoyable. They do bring a certain kind of pleasure. But pleasure is not to be confused with happiness. Those two things are not equal to each other. And a lot of people think sin brings happiness. It never does that. What it does offer is a temporary pleasure to the desires of the flesh. It isn't pure. It's full of disappointment. It's full of pain and full of emptiness. It only offers amusement and excitement and fulfillment of those fleshly desires, but it never offers joy. It never offers happiness. But there is desire in sin. And the second thing I think is what Bobby said, that pleasure is temporary. It is passing. Now, there's probably a couple of reasons why it is temporary. What would be some of those reasons, or a reason? Why is it only passing pleasure?
Well, one reason is because of this life. This life is temporary.
Okay, and I think that's a reminder here is that the ability of sin to provide some pleasure exists only as long as the physical exists. And when the physical's gone, while there's no more pleasure left in sin, Art?
Maybe people who enjoy drugs
Yep.
for a while, and then they're really on a high.
Uh-huh.
Then what happens? They really hit the bottom.
Sure, yeah. Does sin sometimes actually shorten the life of the person who's involved in it? And drugs would be a great example of that. It can destroy the body, and all of a sudden now that life is abbreviated, and then that person has to learn the reality that sin's pleasure is only passing, and it actually impacted us physically, and sometimes it does that. And then sin itself, when you involve yourself in sin, even if your physical life still continues, like you're involved young and you're going to actually live to be old, even while you're involved in sin, do you find that sin is empty pretty much quickly while you're in it? Does it leave people ultimately dissatisfied while they're still sinning? And so in every possible way, sin's pleasure is a very fleeting thing. It's very quick and passing. So I think that's a profound point made here in verse 25, that we enjoy the pleasures, the passing pleasures of sin. It's only for a season that we do that. All right, then in verse 26, we start getting this sort of a bullet list of things that Moses did. Verse 26, he esteemed the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked for the reward, which is sort of the explanation for the choice that he makes. He was obviously longing for the reward, and when it says here that he looked for the reward, what reward do you think he's looking for? I think it's heaven. And what's interesting is people who say this is Canaan, and I can understand that from his initial standpoint to be involved in the promises of God, that might look intriguing. But according to Numbers chapter 20, something happened, and what did he never get? He never got Canaan. Because remember when he struck the rock and he was supposed to speak to it, and what did God tell Moses in that moment? You're not going. You're not going to lead the people over, okay? You've done this. You disobeyed me. You're not going over. Now, he was allowed to look at it, but he was never allowed to go in over it. At least not then, because later, after he's dead, he does get there on the Mount of Transfiguration when Jesus is in Canaan and he's transfigured. Who's there? Elijah and Moses. But he didn't get there in his earthly life. But I think it's heaven. I think heaven is exactly what he's thinking of, because in back of all of these examples is their desire for something better. And in fact, we're going to see it again in just a moment, that somebody was desiring a better resurrection. We're going to see that. So heaven is what's in mind here, and he was willing to do that. He was willing to suffer the reproach of Christ. Now, this is the tough part of this verse, I think, because how could he understand Christ at this point? What does that mean that he was willing to suffer the reproach of Christ? Because Christ wasn't around for millennia until after Moses. What could that mean? Because if you walked up to Moses and said, "Why are you willing to do all this? You gave up Egypt for this," would he have said, "Well, I'm doing this for Jesus"? He didn't understand Jesus at that point. So what does that mean? Art, what do you think this means?
He and God were pretty close.
Yes?
Talked about a lot of things.
Yeah?
We don't know what all.
And according to Deuteronomy 18, he comes as a type of the Christ, that's for sure, because there's one coming that's a prophet like Moses. So Moses is a prefiguring of Jesus in some way. So maybe as a type of the Christ. I think the idea is that he was reproached in a way like Jesus Christ. When he chose to do the right thing, what was the result of choosing to do the right thing? He was rejected, and Jesus chose to do the right thing, and Jesus was rejected. And so in that way, all reproach is like the reproach of Christ. Tommy, I saw your hand.
It's like we can know something is going to happen, but we may not know the specifics.
Oh, yes. Yeah. And anytime we cast our lot with God, and we suffer because of that, ultimately all of it it culminates in Jesus. And so in that way, I think the writer can say that. Then in verses, again, verse 27 through 29, you have it's just a bullet list. Oh, sorry, Bobby, go ahead.
I was going to say one other thing here, too. Christ left the throne before him. He left heaven.
Oh, yeah.
He was in a royal place that he left
Yeah.
to come serve us.
Very similar.
Moses was in a royal place.
Very much.
He left it.
Yeah, very much so. So a lot of similarities between the two. All right, so then with Moses, you just see this running list of things that happened by faith in his life, and a lot of it is coming out of Egypt. And verse 27, here's the first on that list. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, because he endured as seeing him who's invisible. Now, I know there's a lot of debate in comments on this section as to when this applied, and a lot of them will say this is when he left Egypt. He wasn't afraid, but he did run from Egypt. I don't think that's what's in mind. I think this is a reference to when he came back to Egypt, because who did he stand before and combat against? He stood against Pharaoh, and albeit a different Pharaoh, it's still part of that hierarchy, part of that destiny that went through Pharaoh, but he forsook Egypt. I think here it's Exodus 5 beginning when he, on the order of God, goes back and he tells Pharaoh, let God's people go so they can go out and worship in the wilderness. I think that's probably a better reference here, because I think the earlier reference was made back in verse 24. Then in verse 28, it says, by faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood. What's that a reference to? When did that happen? What was it? Okay, this happens within the plagues. Now, they did observe the Passover once they left Egypt, but this is during the plagues. It was the 10th plague. It was the death of the firstborn. And what did they have to do for preparation? All right, so the blood comes from a lamb. They take the lamb, and in killing the lamb, they take the blood and they use the hyssop. They're using it like a paintbrush here, and they're painting the doors, the sides of the door, and above the door, the lintel. They're painting that with blood. And God said, when I come through the land of Egypt, when I see that, then what will I do? I'll pass over you. And that becomes the context for the observance of the Passover from then until it was ended at the end of that age, when the Old Testament was over with. The Passover becomes a remembrance of that night when God passed over to avoid the death of the firstborn. Now, it wasn't limited just the Egyptians. It would have affected anybody within the Israelite nation who did not do that, because God warned them all. And it wasn't just people, it was animals too. It was firstborn across the board of animals and people. And in Exodus 12, verses 12 through 48, we can read about the Passover. And God did come through, and it was the breaking point for Pharaoh. Pharaoh said at that moment, just get out and take what you need and leave me alone. Although that was short-lived. And you get a sense of that here in verse 29 when he says, by faith they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, whereas the Egyptians attempting to do so were drowned. And so they make it to the Red Sea. If you look at a map, and we're not going to follow this too much right now, but if you look at a map where they were cornered. And that's why the Israelites, when they looked behind them, they said, you brought us out here to die. Because either we go in the sea and drown, or we turn back and we're going to be slaughtered by the Egyptian army. And God just creates the path right through the sea. And of course, they make it through on dry land. And as soon as the Egyptians have brought their chariots in, God closed the sea and it destroyed them. And we can read about that in Exodus chapter 14, verses 1 through 31. Now, he did this for a couple of reasons. Back in verse 27, it said he was able to do all of this because he endured as seeing him who is invisible. Have we left the first part of this chapter? Faith is the evidence of things not seen. And every example we've seen so far in Hebrews chapter 11 is it's people acting on the invisible God, but they have full confidence in his ability to do what he says that he can do. And so Moses had faith in God, and this is the example that's illustrating verse 1 again, that faith is the substance of things hoped for, it is the evidence of things not seen. We've never left that, because everybody's, from Noah all the way until now, we've never left that. All right, now, beginning in verse 30, we start getting maybe a few specific examples, but we start getting just more generic examples There's not an exploration of some of the stories of faith as much as just quick mentions of that as a way of just sort of supplementing what's already been said. So, verse 30, you've got the walls of Jericho falling down, which reminds us that faith accepts that with God all things are possible. And the walls of Jericho, this is not, you see you can see flimsy concrete walls today, and with a little bit of force you can push them down. What kind of walls were these in Jericho?
15 to 20 feet.
Yeah, they were massive. I mean, just massively wide, and they were high enough that it was a somewhat impregnable city. I mean, with time, maybe, but this is an example that reminds us of the impossibility of what this was, of the people alone to just march around the city by natural means. Marching around a city would not drop the walls of this highly defensed city like Jericho. And this is an example that their faith was posited in the God who was capable of bringing those walls down. Gene?
You being a military man,
Yes?
why do you march route step across the bridge? Because if you march normally instead of random step, you can set up a rhythm
Yes.
that will bring the bridge down.
Right? Yeah. But that couldn't have happened. That could not have happened here. And there's no, you march around a city, you go around it once, and then on the last day you go around it 7 times and blow your horns. How does that bring down a wall? It doesn't. Not like these, not like Jericho. And by the walls falling down, they were reminded, was this their own effort or God who did this? It was definitely God who did this. And so the Israelites were participants in the victory because they obeyed God, but God alone granted the victory on this occasion. Jericho was a strong city, but God was stronger. That's what they were learning. The walls were humanly impossible to conquer in the fashion that they did, but not impossible to God. And they were able to participate by faith in that. So another example of an incredible moment in history afforded by faith. Then in verse 31, you've got what happens in that story, which is Rahab. Verse 31, by faith the harlot Rahab did not perish with those who did not believe when she had received the spies with peace. Joshua 2 tells us that story, beginning in verse 1. And in verses 18 and 19 of chapter 2 of Joshua is where we see the conditions given to Rahab. She had to hang something out of her window. Do you remember what it was? Yeah, scarlet cord out of her window. And if she would do that, which is acting on faith that what they were telling her was true, because they were representatives of God, that when the walls of Jericho would come down, her and her family would be saved. What is under consideration here is not her harlotry, right? Because people struggle with this, where they say, how could God reward this woman because of her harlotry? It's not rewarding her because of her harlotry. He's rewarding her because of her faith. And if you read chapter 2, we'll not take the time to read it all this morning, but if you read chapter 2, does she have some understanding of the God of heaven? Yeah. I don't want to read the whole chapter, but go back with me to Joshua chapter 2. This is why she's rewarded. Look at Joshua chapter 2. Joshua chapter 2. So the spies come in, right? You got the spies, and she with her hospitality and her kindness, she shields the spies from being found out. Verse 9. And in this conversation, here's what she says. I know that the Lord has given you this land. So she's already heard of the exploits of the children of Israel. And by the time the spies make it to her, she understands that everything they've conquered is due to who? Now that's incredible faith on her part to do that. And that the terror of you has fallen on us, and that the inhabitants of the land are faint-hearted because of you. She goes, I understand the fear of the people because you're mighty through God to do this. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt. We heard about the crossing of the sea. Now, there are people today who disbelieve that. She wasn't there to see it, but did she believe that the water was parted when they came across? It's pretty great faith on her part. And what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites who were on the other side of the Jordan, Sihon and Og, who you utterly destroyed, they heard about these massive victories that they had experienced in their movement toward Canaan. And she's, it's verse 11, as soon as we heard these things, our hearts melted. Neither did there remain any more courage in anyone because of you. For the Lord, your God, He is God in heaven above and of earth beneath. Now, therefore, I beg you, swear to me by the Lord, that is, make your promise by the Lord, since I've shown you kindness, that you will show kindness to my father's house and give me a true token. Spare my father, my mother, my brothers, my sisters, and all that I have, and deliver our lives from death. Does it sound like this woman has faith in God? She does. And she's acting on that, right? She's acting on that because she knows of the capability of God. So Rahab is different. And the Bible even says, there's a contrast in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 31. She did not perish with those who did not believe. So you have many who did not believe, but you have Rahab who did believe. And that's the reason she did not perish. And so faith makes us, interestingly, on this account, usable in the plans of God. And I think there's something we'll follow. Don, and then Bobby.
I think it also points out that just because a person is living in sin, they are redeemable. So God used a person that was living in sin to do His will, and she and her household.
And a lot of people think because of what I've done, I'm unusable. But he could use a murderer like Paul, and he could use a harlot like Rahab. Be turning your Bible to Matthew chapter 1. Bobby, go ahead.
Her faith was greater than the whole tribe of Israel.
Yes.
Other than Joshua and Caleb.
Joshua and Caleb. It really was. Yeah. She had more trust in what God could do than the people did. Matthew chapter 1. Obviously, in the first 17 verses, you've got Matthew's account of the genealogy, the line of Jesus to establish the royal right to the throne. Drop down to verse 5. Do you see a name in verse 5 that's interesting? Whose name do you see? Salmon begat Boaz by Rahab. And you remember the story of Ruth? Who does Ruth end up marrying? Boaz. And then you see the line, Boaz begat Obed by Ruth, Obed begat Jesse, Jesse begot David the king. So God took someone who was, by all accounts, according to human standards, unusable. This is what Don was talking about. She demonstrates great faith, and where does He put her? Right in the middle of the seed line. He puts her right in the middle of the seed line, through whom the Christ would eventually come. So I think it's an amazing, that's what faith did for that woman. Faith makes us usable in the plans of God. All right. Go back to Hebrews chapter 11. Look at verse 32. Verse 32. All right, and notice he says, what more shall I say, right? So he's just going to start throwing out just examples, not off the top of his head because he's inspired, but he's just going to start throwing out just, proliferous examples of faith. You've got Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, and of David, and Samuel, and then generically he says, and the prophets, which means it's open to anybody who fits these descriptions. Now, here's where some folks have a problem. Gideon, Samson, Jephthah, did some of those guys have trouble in their life with sin? They sure did. Well, Jephthah was no good, and especially at the end, David, he not only did he number Israel, which God told him not to do, he also committed adultery with Bathsheba and murdered her husband. You've got Gideon, and remember when we studied Judges, Gideon has a really good beginning, and at the very end of his life, they build, these ephods, and they're offering to the ephods, and so a lot of these guys had problems. Samson, good guy? Not a really good guy. These folks had problems, and a lot of folks look at this and they say, how can God reward these men by mentioning them in the halls of faith? Well, there's an explanation for that. What is God praising here? Where though? Look at verse 33. Who, and when it talks about subduing kingdoms and working righteousness and obtaining promises and stopping the mouths of lions, who's he talking about? That list of folks that he mentions in verse 32. So he's telling us specifically how they got mentioned in the halls of faith here. All right, so he's not talking about every single moment of their life, but these moments that are definable by their faith. And so from verse 33 down through verse 35, we have this this sort of generic list of these amazing moments in history and how they identify or connect themselves to the faith of these individuals. Because many of these men had problems. That's not what God was praising. He's talking about how that faith is so monumental, it defines their legacy in Scripture. And because he mentions the prophets, it's not limited to just the men who are mentioned. So let's talk about some of these. Verse 33, subdued kingdoms. Well, Jephthah did that, right? So did David, so did Gideon, with the Midianites. Joshua helped conquer the land of Canaan. They worked righteousness, meaning they worked as agents of justice for God. And that's not a note of their personal righteousness or their failures, but is to say that they worked on behalf of God's righteousness, and all of them did that. They obtained promises, meaning that they received the blessings based on their compliance to the will of God. They stopped the mouths of lions. That's not just one story. Did even Samson stop the mouth of a lion? All right, so Samson did that. David did that because David killed his own lion. Daniel escaped the mouths of the lion in Daniel chapter 6. They quenched the violence of fire. The first thing off the top of my head is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, because they did that. They escaped the edge of the sword. Remember when Jezebel said, "Off with Elijah's head," and he escapes? So there's an example of that kind of example of faith. He was made strong out of weakness, and really all of them were that way. Even at the end of Samson's life, when he was blinded and beaten to death, was he made strong in his weakness? Brought the temple of the pagans down. Hezekiah did the same thing. In Hezekiah's sickness, he was made strong again. They became valiant in battle. Barak even did that. David did that. So these men are mentioned because of their exploits of faith, not for any other reason. They turned to flight the armies of the aliens. Almost all of these men did that, conquering the Philistines and the Moabites, the Assyrians, and the Ammonites, all because of faith. Yeah, Tommy?
A lot of times when we read something, we kind of come up short with really what's going on. We can ask the question, why did the men go to Rahab's house to start with? It doesn't say anything about her character, it just says what she was and as far as what she did. It says nothing about her faith in God. And so why did they end up at Rahab's house?
Right.
Not a person that was more moral and upstanding and all that. So she could have been a person of great faith before any of this ever.
Oh, it seems to be. And the fact that she's called the harlot does not mean that she's currently a harlot. It could have been something she did in the past, and people are known for their past, and so it could be something. So I think that's right. Verse 35, women received the dead raised to life. And remember, both Elijah and Elisha helped raise boys of women that they came across. And it says others were tortured. Interestingly, the word tortured here has been taken in two senses. Some take this to be a reference to scourging. I could see that because the word itself means to beat like a drum. It's kind of like that. And sometimes in scourging, with the skin stretched tight on the back, it could sort of mean that. But it likely here is reference to the practice that in some cultures they had like these pallets where you were kind of like on the skin of a drum. You were just placed on it and you were beat to death on that. But either way, it was horrible. And their refusal was driven by their expectation in verse 35 of a resurrection. They were waiting for a better resurrection. And that does not mean the restoration of their physical life, because that's not much better. They were waiting for something beyond that, which goes back to verses 13 through 16. So here is he throws out a list of men and said, consider some of these historical examples and others like them who did these incredible things by faith. Then in verse 36 to 38, you don't have names mentioned. You just have these horrible things that people of God have experienced, and we can then attach the names or the torture to the time frame in which it was involved, and know that people did experience this by faith. And so you've got verse 36, mockings. I mean, genuinely, has there ever been a time in history when the people of God weren't verbally assaulted? So from the beginning that's happened. Verbally assaulted, you can think, even Jesus experienced that. Verse 36, scourgings. All right, so that's mentioned specifically, scourgings. Visually we can see that. Jesus was not the only person and the only child of God to experience that, but certainly our mind goes to Jesus. Chains and imprisonment. You can think of all the times when God's people have been put imprisoned. Even, you mentioned Joseph earlier, chapter 39 of Genesis. He was imprisoned. They were stoned, which was a common form of capital punishment, especially among the Jews. I just think, I guess all of these are pretty bad, but that's a really horrible way to die, is just to stand there and be stoned to death. But that happened. 2 Chronicles 24, Jesus even makes reference in Matthew 23 to Zechariah, who was stoned. He was the son of Jehoiada. Look at this one. They were sawn in two. That's just hard to imagine. That really happened. In fact, that was it wasn't the most common form of punishment by the Romans, but the Romans did practice that as well, where they would literally saw people in half and usually tack their bodies on display on boards in cities.
That was not uncommon even into the 15th and 16th centuries in Europe and China.
Yeah, and honestly, that's not really too dissimilar from being drawn and quartered when people were just ripped apart. So it's barbaric, but it did happen in history. You're right about that, Tom. And then this one, it's interesting in this long list of, sawn in two and scourged, and it says tempted. And some have said, well, why would that be there? Because it seems like of all the things they experienced, that would be the least of all. But I don't know, because in the context of being killed, what would the temptation possibly be? To deny your faith and live, and that's a huge burden on these people, and yet they were able to conquer that. They were slain with a sword. We have plenty of examples of that. They wandered in sheepskins, goatskins, destitute, afflicted, tormented. They were driven from their homes. They were impoverished. They were tortured. They were harassed, and then they wandered in deserts, mountains, dens, caves. And the people that he's talking about all did this because of faith. We're out of time. I don't want to do this. There's a couple of things here at the end of this chapter where he tells us about the result of this. And one of them is, because of this, because of their actions, the world's not worthy of these folks. The world's pretty sinful and bad, and we didn't deserve folks like this. And then he'll say they've obtained a good testimony. They didn't receive the promise without us, apart from us. And so we're going to talk about that. I do want to kind of explore that, especially in verse 40 when he says, God had something better, and they didn't receive it apart from us. They were not made perfect apart from us. And I want to talk about that a little bit before we delve into chapter 12 next week. But I hope you appreciate chapter 11. Having gone through it now for about 4 or 5 weeks, it is such a significant chapter to the overall discussion to these people of saying, don't give up, don't quit. If people in the past can endure these types of things, then you can make it. And he'll follow that up with his conclusion in chapter 12. Thank you so much for your input. Please do grab a copy of the notes for chapter 12, and we'll start that next Sunday morning. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.